Hi. Welcome to Show Studio's live panel discussions. In these discussions, a selection of Central St. Martin's graduates will discuss and debate the most important topics influencing the season. My name is Jess Gianelli. I'm a photographer and writer based in London, and today our topic of discussion will be race, identity, and diaspora. So let's start by first meeting the panelists. Karina, we can start with you.
Hi, I'm Karina Kelletsko and I'm a photographer. Just graduated from Fashion Communication and Promotion.
And Dana?
Hi, my name's Dana Tahiti. I've just graduated from the BA Fashion Journalism course.
And Camilla?
Hi everyone, I'm Kimia Romian. I just graduated from Fashion Communication and Promotion at St. Martin's.
And Sunny?
Hi, I'm Sunny Fraser. I just graduated from Fashion History and Theory.
And Valeria?
Hi, I'm Valeria. I just graduated from the BA in Fashion Journalism at St. Martin's.
Thanks so much. So nice to be here with you guys. I feel like this year has really unearthed a lot of much needed discussions regarding race and representation. And I feel like it's instigated a lot of reflection on our collective and individual histories and how we've come to be where and who we are today. And it seems like representation is something that a lot of people are either wanting to be addressed or attempting to address at the moment in a lot of different ways. And I wondered, especially reflecting on the shows of this season and the societal and cultural happenings right now, how do you think the issue of representation is being addressed? And this is something that probably like relates to everyone's work. But I was thinking of Valeria in like in focus, as your work deals directly with the notion of representation, as your publication's one that looks to provide a platform for Latin stories. And it'd be really nice to hear a bit like how you see representation right now.
As you said, for my final project, I made a magazine called Voz, and it was sort of my way to try to showcase the Latinx community authentically. I'm from Peru, and I feel like I didn't really think about being Latina until I left Peru. I was just Peruvian, but then once you're outside, you're sort of part of a bigger group, which can be both good and bad, because it does sort of create a community, but it also can erase some of the groups within the community. And we're also like stereotyped a lot as a group. So I wanted my magazine to be a place where Latinx voices were shown authentically. So that's what I was focusing on. I think from working on my magazine, what I've seen is that more and more sort of focus has been put on the community, and some of it does lean towards the stereotypes, but then some of it is actually more about the real people within the community. So I think it's definitely improving, and where our representation is more authentic now, but it's still a long way to go.
And do you feel like your project that you've done was more because there was an absence and you kind of wanted to fill that space?
Yes, so the way I like to think about it was that I sort of was creating the magazine I wanted to have for myself, like growing up or even now. So I think a lot of the magazines we do have in South America still have that very like focus on European designers. So I wanted to sort of tell the story of maybe smaller designers who you wouldn't necessarily hear from in other places.
Thank you. And Camilla, I feel like it relates to your project as well really nicely. Because you're talking about like a whole different group of people, but I suppose like another area that really requires a lot of like visibility right now. So maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Sure, yeah. I think I can very much relate to Valeria because when I started Post Persia as an online platform, I first started it in 2016, working as an online magazine. And back then I used to, exactly as she said, I think I was trying to like fill in the gap that I was also feeling at the time, that there's no space to showcase Persian creatives and their work. So back then I basically was scouting and trying to find like very interesting talents and their work and trying to like somehow showcase their work alongside my work on Post Persia. But for my final major project, I kind of wanted to kind of advance Post Persia and like bring an online library to the platform. So not only you can have the references, the cultural references that people can use, but also to see the people who are using those cultural references and to see what they are creating, what are the new generation taking from the past and like translating it into their own like contemporary language and creating basically new amazing work.
And how would you say that, and this is like open to anyone really, but how would you say that this issue of representation is kind of, I guess, manifesting itself, whether it's like in a good or bad way, in this season, like in the fashions this season or in the catwalks and the campaigns? Like, do you think that things are changing in any kind of way, or like what do you see about that?
I think what was really interesting for me with the Louis Vuitton new show and the video, I think it was just very interesting to see, for example, like cultural references and like the hip hop and I think so many things that we're combining in this season. And it's just very interesting to see how, for example, Virgil's maybe background and like what he used to see and like what he grew up with during his childhood is now reflecting in the collection today. And I think that was like really interesting to see how he basically, I think the same thing that I'm looking for in the people for Post Persia, how they take their references and create new elements for today. I think it's very interesting to me, yeah.
And I feel like like when I think of this idea of liberation, the idea of being able to like, I guess, reference your own culture and kind of like express and share that with other people is like really important. So it's lovely to see how these things are kind of like, I guess, trickling into fashion at the moment. And I feel like also, just as you pointed out, this kind of like mixture, whether it's like fragmentation or additions from different cultures that are kind of coming together, can be a really nice way to, I guess, expand things, you know. And it makes me think, Karina, also of your project that's talking about these like different cultural identities. And so I wonder what you might think about that, like, especially being in London where there's so many different cultures present, you know, and there's kind of like a huge amalgamation of different aspects of different cultures.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think moving to London, I sort of actually, like I grew up, so my mom's Mexican, and so everything that I experienced culturally kind of trickled down through her. And I grew up around like a quite a big Latin community, but it wasn't until I moved to London and started making friends that I started making like Latinx friends and started to really experience a different side of it. Something that, like, you know, I grew up in Brighton, which is like incredibly middle class, like overwhelmingly really, really white. So I never had that experience. And that was what was really liberating when I moved here, and I experienced this other thing. And, you know, going to Elephant and Castle, and there's like some amazing places in North London as well where you can experience food. And, you know, there's something that was always a big part of growing up for me, you know, eating Mexican food and going and visiting my family and experiencing that, but then being able to sort of have a bit more agency and like going to seek places out in London. And so, yeah, like it was such a revelation for me coming here. It's been amazing.
Yeah. And what kind of, I guess, influenced you to, I imagine all of these things, but what kind of like led you into the project that you made?
It's interesting because it's quite, I mean, it's pretty personal, but I think it was sort of like with the pandemic and spending time in lockdown with my parents again, and like trying to really uncover parts of myself, like particularly, you know, growing up with a quite strict Mexican mother, and like trying to like trying to navigate that in a space like as a kid where, you know, everyone's parents are like, for the most part, very different. Like, you know, my parents were, well, my mum particularly was very strict, and there was like certain rules you had to follow and certain things. And so yeah, it just came out of like being close to them during lockdown and like thinking about all these things. And actually the summer before that, I'd gone to Mexico and I was photographing my family, and I kind of had always thought like that was something that I wanted to document because it is such a big part of me. But then obviously the pandemic happened and I couldn't go anywhere. So it just really was like super organic. And I always found like my mum always had really amazing stories. So it was like listening to her stories and like talking to her during the pandemic. And yeah, it was just super organic. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it feels really like I had a similar experience during the pandemic. I guess a lot of us did. It felt quite like forced introspection, you know, and especially if you have to be with family, you have to like go back to where you come from. It's like, and with all of the other things that have been going on as well, with the murder of George Floyd and just a lot of things, the Asian hate riots and campaigns that came afterwards. There's just so many things that are pointing back towards like where we come from, and I think causing us to want to, even if we don't necessarily want to celebrate it, because maybe not everyone does, but just like dig into it a bit more and see what we're about, you know, and how we can share that with other people. And yeah, I think again, this idea of liberation keeps coming up because it's this like overwhelming desire to like be more free, just to exist, really, you know? And yeah, it made me think also of you, Sunny, and your work that's looking at this kind of intersectional Black feminine experience. And I guess back to this idea of like cultural fragmentation and just kind of like these mixing of identities. Like, I'm interested in how you see that and how that kind of plays into what you've written about for your project.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, like a really interesting time to be thinking about these kind of things. Specifically, I wrote about Black femininity in post-war Britain, specifically the Windrush generation, and how women use dress and appearance to form their identities, but also about the colonial subjugation and marginalization of these women. And it was so interesting to, I mean, I'm half Jamaican, so it was personal to me also. My grandma came here in 1962. So I only really know my Caribbean culture from perspective of the UK. So it's really interesting to consider how these identities were formed through the cultural assimilation of being here. It's very relevant right now.
And how, I guess, how do you find like your work and what you're looking into is kind of relating to what people are making, whether it's in fashion or in photography? Like, how do you think these ideas are being expressed otherwise? Like, I feel like I've definitely seen a lot more, again, like these kind of introspective stories, like stories about people's families and their own experiences. But yeah, I guess there's a lot of different ways to approach it as well. And even something like, as you were talking, I thought of the fact that like I'm sitting here with like a scarf on my head, and maybe if my mom saw me, because my mom is like an immigrant from the Caribbean as well, maybe she would be like, are you sure you want to like show up to people in that way, you know? Because it's true, the way that they dressed and the way that they wanted to present themselves was really different. some years ago, you know? Whereas now I kind of feel like we're, not everyone, but I think we're trying to like loosen some of those restrictions and like figure out how we can just like, again, exist without like needing to perform in a certain way, like to perform certain identities to kind of like, I guess, be accepted or seen, you know? It's like, how can we be seen in our truest ways, I guess. And yeah, I feel like in the kind of imagery and through the catwalks, I feel like I am seeing some of that like lean towards individuality, you know? But I wonder, like, for all of you, really, like, do you feel like it's real? Like, do you feel like it's authentic, or it's more like a trope that people are just kind of like grasping towards?
I think it's too soon to answer that question. I mean, to put things into context, it's only been just now a year since George Floyd was murdered, and we saw the groundswell of support again for the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think 1 year is not enough time to know if brands are jumping onto the diversity bandwagon, and having a diverse casting is something we've been seeing increasingly in the last, not just the last year, but the industry's done a really good job, I would say, in the last 5 years of increasing representation. But we've seen in the past where that representation hasn't actually been reflected in the workplace. Jacques and Muse, a couple of years ago, we saw that viral tweet where, you know, the casting was diverse, but the team wasn't at all. And I think until we actually hold brands accountable and we have brave people increasingly coming up from the organizations and these brands saying, okay, this is what the model casting is like, this is what it's like in the workplace, that's when I'll start to really be able to answer that question. And that's what I'm interested in finding out personally.
Like, not just what's on the exterior, but what's really going on inside. Definitely. And I feel like a lot of it, like going to Plaster, the publication that you made, a lot of it comes from this necessity for education as well, you know? And there's always that question, like, whose job is it to educate people on like how they should be, you know? But it seems like education is really something that's necessary in so many different areas. Like, we're grateful to like have the opportunity to study and like learn certain things, but it's like these, I feel like some of these initiatives need to happen in the industry as well, like within the companies. And I don't know, it's like everyone kind of needs a bit of relearning to realize like we need to, it's such like a basic thing, I feel like, to just connect to other people and respect other people's cultures, you know, and to represent a wide array of people. But it just seems like it's something that really needs to be like drilled into people's minds in some way, you know? And yeah, how about you, Camilla? What do you think about, like, I guess this aspect of education and kind of like, what do you feel like, maybe what do you feel like it needs right now? Like, what do people need to be able to be educated in this respect?
I think the more we see change is the more that like our eyes would automatically be trained. And I think the more that brands maybe take this serious, like bigger brands, it will kind of like echo in smaller ones. But I think, yeah, the more that we go down that path, I guess, it's the more that people will see and will know. And obviously they will do more of it.
Go ahead, Dina.
I actually wanted to say, you know, we were talking about representation on the runway and accountability, and this is exactly what led me to write an investigation called Less Talk, More Action, because I was personally frustrated at how easy it is on social media to cancel somebody, to cancel a brand. And I think social media is a place of instant gratification and instant cancellation. And I remember reading something by Lindsay Peoples-Wagner, and she wrote, like, cancel culture isn't great. Who's holding people accountable? So for me, it was really important. I personally wanted to know what was changing since the murder of George Floyd, because if I didn't know if anybody would hold them accountable in the media. So I decided to spend like the 7 months I was working on my magazine, investigating, talking to students, talking to experts to find out, what did the brand say first of all, what's actually happened, and what do we need to do now? And a lot of what we do need to do now is based on the education. And I think educational institutions like the institution that we're at, they have a lot of work to do, and they are holding their hands up. And the thing that I was impressed about was actually, okay, some of it was a lot of like lip service that I came across by certain organizations that I've written about, but actually there is a lot of tangible actions and initiatives that are being put in place, arguably out of pressure and fear of being cancelled, or this time people have realized that it is a necessity and they've woken up to the need to do this now.
No, definitely. And I mean, I guess there's always that question, like should we be upset with people for kind of jumping on the bandwagon because they're afraid to be canceled? Or is it just like, maybe what we needed was to like give that pressure, you know, push people towards that point, and that's what's going to create the lasting change, whether they genuinely want to at first or not. It's still going to like benefit in the long run, you know. And Valeria, I was thinking of you also when Dana was talking about her publication and how she, I guess, addressed certain issues. And I was wondering about, like, in the different people that you've spoken to, like what were the kind of issues that, I guess there were a lot of different ones, but what were the kind of issues that you were going into? Like, what is it, I guess, that people wanted to say about this issue of representation and accountability and everything?
So obviously I wanted Voss to be a place that wasn't just like, look at all these amazing, talented people, but also like talk about the issues faced by the community. So there's a few different stories. One of the ones I think that relates to what you were asking is basically I talked to people who are of Mexican descent who live in LA, because I feel like the Mexican American community in LA has been so widely portrayed in the media and stereotyped a lot. So I was just sort of wondering how, like, what was it like growing up Mexican American in LA in 2021? And I interviewed 6 different people, and they all gave me sort of their different perspectives. Some of them do closely relate to the term Chicano, some of them don't. Some of them say that the term has evolved and changed. So I think that's something that a lot of people maybe don't stop to think about, how like a lot of the stereotypes just are super outdated or like have changed. And they just think like, oh, everyone who's Mexican American is a Chicano, but that's not something that everyone relates to anymore. So I think that was one of the pieces that sort of relates more towards like representation and how they feel about a stereotype that is like associated with their identity.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, like the use of kind of like cultural symbols, and at the same time like this nuance of cultural intersection, like especially being like, I'm in the US right now, so thinking about like the United States or the UK as well, like they're 2 huge places that have tons of cultural intersection, you know, like arguably they wouldn't be the countries that they are without that intersection. And I find it interesting, I guess, first that there's less like understanding or maybe appreciation of the various different cultures and their whatever kind of symbolizes them, and there's more this tendency to stereotype and to maybe pull certain symbols from different cultures and kind of like, I guess in fashion especially, to like capitalize on that, you know, to like, I don't know, slap a do-rag on somebody and make that into something. Or we know this like huge issue of braids on the runway, you know, these kinds of things. Which I guess, yeah, I feel like they fall into this idea of kind of stereotyping, but at the same time, there are certain elements of it that are quite inherent to certain cultures, you know? And I wonder, like, how do you think, I guess, like, is there a right way to address these certain, I guess, identities, especially when they're like the product of two different kind of cultures, maybe, you know? Sunny, what do you think about that?
I think it's difficult because, I mean, if you're talking in terms of brands, it depends whose idea the concept is. So like you have like a Wells Bonner where that's really personal to her, like speaking that truth. But then, yeah, I don't know how it is appropriate to think about these intersections if you're speaking from a brand that's made up of all white staff. Like it's difficult to navigate that space when the people in power haven't experienced that and don't have any experience of cultural intersections or marginalization. So it makes it difficult.
Yeah, and I think back to that issue that was brought up before, that how things need to kind of change behind the scenes, you know, rather than just like externally. And I think that is like one of the most important things. Like, how can you expect like the stories to be authentic and different if the people who are telling them are all the same people who like don't have anything to do with them, you know? Yeah, and I think again it comes back to this idea of education, and maybe in a different way. Like, I think it's wonderful the fact that we can all sit here and like have this conversation, you know, and be a part of that, I guess, that move towards change and towards representation, that we can each have a say about what's going on, you know. I think that's really amazing, but it kind of needs to continue, like that needs to be perpetuated. And I think by the work that you guys are making, that definitely kind of instigates that, and it puts that pressure on people to realize like, okay, we definitely have to say something about this, because like if not, who's gonna like buy our products, who's gonna be interested in our stories, you know? And I was thinking about you also, Karina, in terms of like, I guess from a more image making perspective, like how do you find, I guess, this, I don't know if I want to say, like, yeah, the authenticity of kind of storytelling and how that plays into, I guess, campaigns is an interesting thing, because it's totally just like, it's not like an editorial where you might be more influenced to like tell a story. You're trying to sell something outright, you know?
Yeah. God, it's a hard one. I think when you're trying to sell something, it's hard because I guess they want to make money. So it's like, how can you make something really personal and not exclude people? You know what I mean? So yeah, I don't know, from like I guess a more commercial perspective, I mean, it's something that I've like struggled to like make that decision in my mind of like, how would I be able to, if I were approached by a brand or something, to be like, oh, do this campaign, but do it with like your authentic voice. It would be, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I think, but in a way it's kind of, maybe this isn't really answering the question, but I do think in a way it would kind of, if for me, like I found it so difficult actually to portray my experience in an sort of image form, because I felt like it is a kind of it's a bit more of a convoluted way of trying to explain like how like a culture, like because my dad's Danish and my mom's Mexican, and they're both very different, like sort of disparate cultures in a way. One like being very European, very white, and the other one not so much. But I mean, yeah, that's up for debate, I guess. But I don't know, it just
Yeah, I guess like I feel like if you're talking about visually representing the kind of mixture of these experiences, and especially like being in the UK, that must be really like there's so many different things that you could pull from, you
yeah.
know.
Yeah, I think sort of the thing that I started to find, because I was very lost at the beginning. I knew what my voice was and I knew what I was trying to say, which was trying to portray like, you know, this sort of trickle down like experience of culture, but also like the pain of being like a teenager and like wanting to be a certain type of person, but then also having like, you know, your family there and having that familial experience. And so yeah, then I started realizing that actually the things like such as food, or such as things such as like, you know, items like household items, or like things that I'd grown up around, that sort of allowed me to navigate that more, and it allowed me to like put the experience into images rather than it being like some really kind of more abstract concept. Don't know if I've just rambled for ages, but hopefully that makes sense.
No, definitely. I guess because that it goes back to that idea again of cultural symbols. There's certain things that we can cling on to, you know, that make it a bit easier to, I guess, like to share and express whatever part of our cultures that we want to. And I feel like it does get a bit like tricky when it comes to, I guess, wanting, like you were saying about campaigns, when the goal is to have like as many people be influenced by it as possible so that people will buy it, you know? But like, it's really hard to, or maybe not it's really hard, but what's interesting is how we can figure out how to like make space for all these different narratives, you know, and find the way to kind of include them without it becoming, I guess, this like obvious trope or this obvious like ticking of a box, you know, to kind of find that authenticity, whether it's through like a totally diverse team and everyone kind of like, yeah, offering different tidbits of influence from these different symbols that, like, even if we all come from different backgrounds, we all can relate through food, for example, because everyone has like a different type of food, you know, there's different kind of, I guess, rituals around food and around dress and all of these things that I guess tie into identity. Like at the end of the day, even if the ways that we perform them are different, the fact that we all have them is what kind of links us together, you know. And maybe we can do a bit more of trying to understand everyone's to figure out how to like make space for it, you know. um but yeah, I think something, I guess we have a little bit more time, and I'm interested in how you find, Camilla, I guess again, yeah, this issue of cultural intersection and kind of like the use of cultural symbols. Like how do you find it plays into like specifically the kind of Persian creatives that you're working with and looking into?
I think something that's really interesting to me is that moving to London and living my whole life in Iran, basically before I moved here for 18 years, I found it difficult quite in the beginning because it's a big contrast, you know, like having to live a certain way for your whole life and then to move here. But one interesting thing that I came across after like 5 years of living here is that you kind of get elements and you add elements of like things that you see around you and like people from different backgrounds. And what I want to say is that basically in the end, you kind of build, like for me, that's what happened for me personally. You build your own kind of, I can't say culture, but like your own identity. So I think this was really interesting to me to see I can still have what I have grown up with, all the like cultural references, basically everything that was taught to me from when I was a kid, and then moving here and like getting to live this very different life. from like all that I've seen and to like combine them together. I think that really showed through my work throughout the years. And it was just really interesting to me to like go through this change basically and like see the outcome in a way. I think it will be kind of the same thing with brands, I guess, just how they mix things together and then the outcome. It's kind of very interesting. Yeah, that's how I think.
And Sunny, what do you think about, like, I guess, again, everything is kind of related to this mixture of cultures. And when you think about the like Caribbean woman's experience, like between post-war and now, like how do you think, I guess, how do you think that's changed? And especially through the idea of like dressing and kind of presenting oneself to the world.
I think it's changed like monumentally. I think when women, I mean, in the context of the UK specifically, when women first came here, it was kind of a suppression of your Caribbean identity, except when you were in the space of the Caribbean community. So women were adhering to Western dress standards even before coming over here. So from the Caribbean, women were still in the same silhouette that women were wearing in the UK because we thought of the UK as the motherland. And I talk a lot about hair straightening practices and then the natural hair movement of the 70s. So I think it progressed quite significantly after people were building communities. And then it's escalated from that, especially now. I think there's a lot more emphasis on celebration of culture as opposed to repressing your culture to assimilate to your host culture, essentially.
And you, Valerie, as well, like, what do you feel about that? I guess it's a similar, like, when I think, because again, my family is from the Caribbean, and sometimes when I have my friends that are from Latin America, there are certain, like, the cultures are widely different. But recently I've been doing research into this idea as well of the kind of, again, cultural intersections between the two places because of colonization and because of, like, I guess, the tendency to then sort of go back to the colonizer in some kind of way, you know? So how would you say, I guess, yeah, how would you say this current movement towards decolonization, I want to say, like, how do you think that affects, like, I guess, the culture and the way that people maybe were dressing before and acting before in reference to the colonizer?
I think before, like, even for me, before I maybe made even more of an effort to like not have an accent when I talk. I don't think I have a heavy accent, but now I don't care as much. Like when I talk, if I say something wrong or like mispronounce something, I just don't care anymore. And like the fact that I learned different languages already, like a big accomplishment, I think. So I think definitely now people are prouder to just show who they are and don't try to assimilate as much. And yeah, I think, for example, the GmbH collection, it was sort of taking the idea of how before designers used to go on like research trips to different countries and sort of like take elements from someone else's culture and reinterpret them, usually without knowing the culture really. And so it was flipping that and doing that with like whiteness, and sort of like it was very like country club, Ralph Lauren, that sort of thing, but it was done in a very like clever and satirical way. So I think that also relates to what you were saying, and it's sort of like a way of combating that in a way, being very like satirical and clever, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really easy to get quite like intense and I guess even intimidating when it comes to, because I guess we have all this pent up stuff. We want to be free and we want to share everything. And I think it is really nice when that can be like, these issues can be combated in a lighter way, you know? and like how we can figure out, and it comes back to the subject of education again, I guess, like how we can combat that and like almost like make people want to know, you know, but even if they don't, like it's okay because we're going to show you anyway, but like how can we kind of make it, I guess, like, yeah, I guess accessible. That's the thing about it, you know, like how can we make everything a lot more accessible for, but again, is that our, like, do we have to do that, or is it other people's job to figure out like the way into it to try to understand it, you know? Does anyone have anything to say about that?
I mean, I think obviously it has to start from, like, even myself, I always need to like want to be educated and do the job myself and not wait for other people. Like, it's not, I don't think it's other people's responsibility to like educate me on topics I'm not informed about. So like while doing my project, obviously I sort of like struggled a bit with the term Latino because it's such a, like, it's a term that is used to like join us, but sometimes that sort of excludes people. So for example, a lot of people don't understand that there are white Latinos, that there are Black Latinos, that there are Indigenous Latinos. So for example, my project, I also did a podcast and I spoke to Josue Perea, who works in the Afro-Latino Forum in New York. And we sort of like talked about how the stereotype of what a Latino person is or is supposed to be affects the Afro-Latino community. So I think that was sort of me showing that it's not like the term Latino or Latinx can be powerful and join us, but we also have to, like, for it to be powerful, we have to acknowledge that it can also be problematic in certain aspects. So I think, yeah, we definitely have to start by educating ourselves and looking for the resources ourselves.
Let's see. Yeah, I mean, I think when I was thinking of the talk, I was trying to imagine like what are the most, I guess, prevalent things that we need to discuss. And I mean, we talked a lot about representation and this cultural intersection and education and cultural symbols. And I feel like these things are really like of utmost importance for the moment right now. But do you think there's anything that maybe we haven't discussed that you really feel is like maybe something you saw in the shows or even something that you're thinking about from what you've made that you think is really important as well?
I think something that I would just say about this debate about cultural appropriation and in the shows, some of us were discussing how we think that there should be lived experience if you're going to reference a culture. I definitely think that that's the ideal situation because, you know, you hear it from the horse's mouth and you can trust that instantly. You have that trust there and that knowledge and lived experience. But I think we shouldn't exclude people from being able to take inspiration from a culture that doesn't have a connection to their heritage or ethnicity, because how can fashion like survive and thrive and change if we only take inspiration from what we know? Because otherwise we'll just be in an echo chamber, right? So I think the key to not appropriating a culture, like I'm also from Iran, like Kimia, but I was born here, and I think I would have no problem with somebody that is an Iranian referencing our culture and art, providing that they speak to someone who knows about it and they reference and they respect the source. So I think that's the key thing to take away from me is do your research and make sure you credit the right people, because we have seen in the past designers haven't done that, and that's when they get called out and cancelled on social media.
Absolutely, yeah. And does anyone else have anything to add on that? I mean, I definitely agree. And I think this issue of cultural appropriation, there's a lot of times where I feel like this idea of cancel culture is so prevalent that everyone's just trying to like close doors everywhere, you know, like you can't get in here. And I don't think that's the point. Like you're saying, like we have to, in order to move forward, in order to have this kind of acceptance of different cultures, we need to have a window into them, you know, and figure out how, I guess if someone is interested in another culture, it's really lovely, you know, it's amazing if they can, with reverence and respect, like learn about that culture and share it in their way. And in that way, that's how you have kind of respectful cultural intersection, you know, rather than this kind of colonialist mentality, like I'm going to go and take that thing and not give you any credit, or not even, you know, not even back source and figure out the truth of it, you know? So I completely agree. I think it's a huge thing for fashion and the wider world in general. Like if we're trying to come closer together, we definitely need to be able to look into each other's cultures and learn more about each other, because that's the point of it. It's just like it comes down to respect and yeah, respect and reverence at the end of the day. That's absolutely what's necessary. And I mean, that's a huge topic. It's a shame we don't have so much time, but I think that might be a really nice way to end, unless anyone has any last thoughts about it. Yeah. So thank you to all the panelists, and thank you all for watching. For more extensive Fashion Week coverage, be sure to visit showstudio.com. And if you're watching via Show Studio's YouTube, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe below. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.